I'm Eva Oh, and this is the Teakink podcast. I've been a dominatrix since 2011, and I would like to spill the tea on my life. Thank you for listening. Power, a miniseries. In the last episode, I talked about what is a dominatrix, and it started getting me thinking about a lot of the things that underpin what it means to be a dominatrix. And it kind of brought to light this idea or this understanding of how obviously important power is. But I thought that it could be something interesting for me to explore, actually. So this is the beginning of a mini-series to do with power, lessons from a dominatrix. So we're going to start off with what is power to me, a dominatrix. We're going to move into an episode about why I think the dominatrix is a product of the power struggles that we experience. And we're going to end in an episode about something that is very influential around the capacity for power, money. We're going to talk about how the transactional nature of the commercial dominatrix experience is influenced by money and what this experience has taught me about money in general, and how I've come to understand where power lies because of my interactions with money in this job. So stick around. But we're going to start, I was going to say simple, but I think it's not so simple. What is power? When you look at definitions, it's about an ability. Yeah, an ability to enact, an ability to maneuver and manipulate. But what specifically has being a dominatrix taught me about power? I think not only playing the roles of power dynamics over and over again, I think that has taught me something about how it can exist in an interaction. But I think also, especially when I have had longer term arrangements with clients and submissives, I've really started to understand how much our context has to do with these seemingly lovely, neat little titles that are not that simple in the end. So, in a dominatrix experience, in a power exchange experience or relationship, ongoing client relationship, however, can be negotiated to look in different ways. But let's say we're just going to talk about the most simplistic vessel of I am the dominant and my client is the submissive, and I am to give the direction and the submissive is to follow the direction. And one would say that I would have the power, if we're just going to talk about it in a simple sense of the direction and the following. But very quickly, I come to understand that I'm in this position because I need to work. And they are in a position of being able to pay me because of their financial capacity. They have asked for a certain experience. I have also made the decision to enact a certain experience. So who has the power here? I think what even just that little initial step, we're not even talking about we've started a session or we've gone the distance into like an annual retainer and we're now in like relationship-ish territory. Even in that little interaction, that little start, things are murky. I think that the job has really taught me that we can give these neat titles to ourselves, me as the dominatrix, the dominant, and you as the submissive. But nothing is actually that neat. And I think that it's been interesting for me to create a relationship with feeling like I have agency and power by whether it's creating financial means for myself or as a barrier, as like a buffer, which we can get into more in the third episode, or by learning mechanisms in order to maneuver the way that people are going to think. I think that the skills of the job and the fruits of the labor have been useful in me learning how to accrue more space to have more ability to influence in the world. But it still all feels very, very complex and like a struggle. And I'm sure there's lots of people who have been talking about power who are far more researched than I am. But this is just a little sliver of the things that I've learned being in this job. That a part of me is sometimes unsure as to who ultimately holds the power. But maybe I think it's a good exercise to be aware of in order to approach our world in a more critical manner. But sometimes when you're within the experience, submitting to the confusion can make it a far more difficult predicament. So we step into our simplistic titles and we act out and enact out our variations of artifice. And we have a good time. So what has being a dominatrix taught me about power? I also think that there's some, very interesting things that have happened over the years, not only from within the job. Sure. So the practice of you being given this role that already gives you a little bit of like backing in your own mind, right? And so when you're entering a play space with somebody, you're kind of already like in a character, right? And so then you learn to pick up things from that character. It's like method acting, maybe in a way. And those things, if you practice them a lot, start to filter off into your day-to-day. So I feel like being a dominatrix, like prior to being a dominatrix, I was a lot less assertive and a lot less practiced in understanding how somebody might be thinking and therefore how to engage with it and maybe maneuver it. So I feel like a lot of my understanding of power is to just basically do with my engagement with the information that's sort of come my way. And I feel like one particular thought is coming up for me that, yes, being in the job has taught me that it's actually a very murky situation. It's not as easy as this is your role and this is your role and you're at the one with power, definitely, for sure. But there's definitely some things that I've started to own in my behavior and my movement that I started to notice maybe about 2 or 3 years in really shook the people around me. It's been this interesting wave. So I was, very average sort of engagement with society, walking around in a way that wasn't maybe as confronting as the way that I maybe stand now and talking in turn and all of this shit. Like trying to fit in to my place that I was given. And then I get into this role, and then I start to understand that there are other ways of potentially being, and that these other ways are welcomed by certain other people who are engaging in certain other ways, that there are different ways to engage with the world, and that there doesn't have to be this place that I'm given, that I can start to move this place a bit. And so about 2-3 years in to the job, when I feel like I've started to really take on these mannerisms and this pacing and my not talking when I should be talking, sort of little cues, social cues, I'm starting to be more assertive. I start to notice how unsettling it is to others. Mm. I remember this particular time when I was in Hong Kong on like the tail end of some sessions, and I had gone out. It was like a rooftop party or something, and it was full of to be expected bankers. And I feel like when I was younger, I sort of was like quiet, and I did have people approaching me, but people would react in a either curious or very like yeah, they wanted to just like sleep with me. Sort of manner. Yeah, like kind of making their moves towards that. But this night felt different. I felt like I was just sitting, but engaging with their attention in perhaps a different way that rubbed a lot of them up the wrong way. I literally was not saying very much, but I think that I had started carrying myself in a different way, and the way that maybe I would interject every now and then in a conversation would just be a little bit more challenging to the status quo of how a femme person should be interjecting. And that might have been the first time when I started to see people getting uncomfortable just by the way that I was existing, sitting, saying things every now and then. And then, if you've listened to the podcast before, there was this one particular episode, actually, where there was this guy who reacted really poorly to the fact that I was a dominatrix. Like, we hadn't even really exchanged on very much, but I wasn't reacting in the ways that he was used to that women reacting to him. And it really irked him that he went through a whole range of distress, attacking me, like verbally, trying to take up space around me. Basically, it had triggered something in him where he realized that he couldn't exist within this usual power paradigm, and that he felt threatened by that, even though I was half his size, quite literally, and didn't really say very much. Didn't challenge him verbally. Yeah, it was just my sheer indifference to his existence that shook the foundations of how he understood the world to be. Yeah, and he didn't like that. So I think that it's just by asserting myself in session space and learning how to just stand my ground a little firmer in the day-to-day, it's kind of taught me that these power structures within people is really quite delicate, and that a lot of them have really strung their hopes on things being where they were told that they should be. And as soon as there's even just a little glimmer of how somebody is standing a little bit more like strong within themselves, it threatens that reality that maybe they never really belonged in themselves. Yeah. So it's been an interesting little ride in understanding that it's not so clear even when I'm being given this title of a dominatrix, and even when the submissive is supposed to follow instructions, that the choices that we're making to get there are complex, that the financial transaction, that the often place of the client as a man and me as a woman, that the skills that I take from this assertion that I learn in this play space out into the world by simply standing or maybe not saying something in a certain tone, that the frameworks of power in assumed power between interactions starts to crumble for people. It's like, I guess it's also taught me that everything is just so delicate and potentially dangerous depending on how people react to their realities being questioned. And not even questioned directly, but questioned indirectly by an example or something that isn't playing to the rules. So what is power, and what has being a dominatrix taught me about power in something a little bit more succinct? Yeah. I think that it can exist, that power can come across and exist in so many different ways that you can sort of assert it in action, in inaction, and that the building blocks of it are just so many and almost so out of reach and so confronting for so many people that it makes it such a delicious thing to play with, but also such a dangerous thing. And sometimes, I mean, yes, when people see me standing on a street or at an event and it starts to like shake them a little bit, we have that. But then we also have in session. And there was this once, I don't know, it might have something more to do with questioning their reality and perception of fantasy. And so maybe I'll go into that in another time. Maybe the fantasy versus reality thing is quite an interesting one to talk about as an independent episode. But the power that you can have within a session also, I think, when somebody's like, yes, I am in a following headspace. Yes, I am in a vulnerable headspace and I am listening to this person. I think that if that person is not comfortable with that space also, that space of vulnerability, and they don't know how to integrate that into their day-to-day. And inversely, for the top or the dominant, if they're kind of like on a power rush, I think it can be a completely offsetting thing for us in our day-to-day too. Like, for example, when I have taken people when I was less experienced, and I've taken people into states of being within session that have really shaken up where they're at. Because yes, they've chosen to be in a vulnerable position, but also, yeah. So basically what happened, I'm thinking of a particular scenario. Over a period of time, I was really going pretty hard. But I do this thing where I feedback what people are doing to them. So if they sort of have taken a moment to think about something, or if maybe like their finger sort of twitched when I mentioned a certain word, I'll kind of tell them about it, and it kind of brings them really into the space and hyper aware of where they're at. And sometimes that can bring them into like a breaking down perception of self and into a state of surrender, which is kind of what I'm going for. But sometimes it can also make them hyper aware to the point where they're so unfamiliar with being aware of themselves that it's far too confronting, and also my bad, because that's dangerous territory to play in, and now I do it in a much softer fashion. But that sort of roles that we've given ourselves and that vulnerability that people are opening up into, it can really leave somebody crashing down when somebody who is their object of who they've given the perceived power for a little while. Yeah, it's just like a potentially dangerous territory. Also, when we suddenly name that there are these roles and that we are playing by them, but actually, perhaps we are not surrendering. It's just like the sweet spot hasn't quite been reached and the self-awareness hasn't quite been there. And what can happen is they can flip and they can blame you for everything. And I think psychologists call this transference. That suddenly they are aware and you are the object that has made that happen, as opposed to just their lack of relationship with themselves. And sort of inversely, like when I first started playing with an understanding of how I could assert myself, the role of the dominatrix, being validated for that over and over again in session, I went crazy for the first like couple of years with this power high. I think some of you might also, if you've listened to past episodes, would have heard this. But what happened was that I had suppressed my desire for having an assertive voice in the world for 26 years, for like since until I was 26, until I became a dominatrix. And suddenly I was given a vessel, like the session space where I could lean into asserting myself. And I was praised for it and paid for it. And it was like all of this validation about that I could be very directive, and it is welcomed in certain states. But I went mad with it, and I just kind of non-consensually engaged in power play in my day-to-day. And I was like slapping dates without asking them for consent in public and things like it was just like all of these years of keeping it down and then not having the right parameters of understanding of what was happening in my like sudden surge. Because obviously I had been versed in the terms of consent for within the dungeon, but I didn't understand that that surge was going to come. And this is something that I do tell a lot of people who are starting in domination, that this like sudden validation for being assertive and even directive, it could give you a little bit of a power high. Yeah. So what is power? It's delicious and dangerous and like everything that I end up really asking all of us to do on this podcast. It's something that requires careful self-investigation as well as a critical eye on how it exists around us. But yeah, I think that's probably maybe a good enough intro to the things that have come up for me when thinking about power and my role as a dominatrix. And I think that I'm going to go much more deeply into dominatrix, the role, and how that intersects with what power is in our world in the next episode. So yeah, just a little intro on the dilemmas that I have faced since 2011 in my journey. Yeah, being a dominatrix has really been an incredible conduit for learning about the little murmurs of what life is because of its countering nature to the way that women are usually supposed to be in the world. Yeah. So, till the next episode, which we will go into that particular point in much more detail, I'll speak to you then.